So hello friends, welcome to Mentor Vikas channel. Here in this video, we are going to see a more advanced example of the use case of use resource and use computed, right? And this is going to be a more practical use case which you are probably going to use in your future Qwik applications, right? So let's start with it. Here, as you can see, we have this advanced example section and I am just going to explain this. But before doing all this, I also willing to give you some brief about this note part, which is provided by the Qwik itself, right? So as you can see here, this section is all about how basically use resource act or works, right? So as we had already discussed, use resource is used for making some external API request and getting the data into our component. And if you are willing to then change that received data in any other form, you can do that by using that use resource hook, right? But fundamentally, this use resource hook is worked as same as that use task, right? But there is some difference, right? So as in case of use task, as use task is also is a hook which basically executes when component initially renders. Okay, so use task is completely a server side part. Okay, a server side kind of hook which basically gives you a component, right? Which gives you the data directly, right? And that use task is initially loaded, initially executed when before the rendering of the component, right? Before the rendering of this, for example, this UI part, right? So this is how that use task works, right? But in a same way, that use resource is also at the very initial stage. So when that use resource is executed that very first time, it also a server side SSR execution. Okay, so what this SSR? So that server side execution, that the first time use effect a use resource executed at the server and it gives you the computed values, right? But use task doesn't gives you that opportunity or that probability to use this function as in client side, right? But use resources have this functionality, like you can give this condition that use resources that whenever something happens, some event triggers or some data changes, you should trigger use resource. Okay, and this next time this use resources act as in client side rendering, right? And one of the main difference between, as this may be probably going to ask in the interview if you are planning to be a Qwik.js developer, right? So there may be a question that, okay, how fundamentally this use task and use resource is different. So one difference I had already told you, right? But the another difference which you have to understand is use resources returns a value, right? Use resources allow you to return a value, but instead that use task is simply doesn't return a value, but it basically it works at the very initially, even at the server side, right? Not on the client side. First thing is this. And the second thing is use resources does not block the rendering while the resource is being resolved, right? So because why it is so? Because as use resource is an async function, right? So first thing is this, right? And the second thing which you have to understand this, it doesn't blocks the rendering of your component, while in case of use task, it basically blocks the rendering of your component till this use task function resolves. Okay, so both are the promises, right? Both are the kind of promises in JavaScript, but this use resource doesn't block the component, right? And but use task does. And at the same time, use resource can be also used as server side rendering and as well as client side rendering based upon the condition where how we are going to use this, right? And one special note where that I also want to disclose here, that resource part that we use, that the resource component that we used with this use resource is not compulsory, right? So that means you can even use the data coming from this use resources without using this resource component. But even though Qwik has given you this opportunity, this component to use the data in a more systematic way, right? So you can if it is not required to create your custom hook or the custom component directly accessing this data, then it is quite useful to go with that resource component, right? So now just move to our advanced example, and here we call this an advanced example because here we are using three more functions, which is three more methods, you can say, which is provided by the Qwik application, right? So what are these three methods? So the first one is AbortController, the second one is track, and the third one is cleanup. Earlier we had discussed about the track. So basically what this track simply does, it basically tracks the value of it simply tracks the state of our application, right? So whatever the state we had mentioned here, whenever the value of this state, for example here in our case it's query, whenever the value of this query changes, this user resource will recompute this value and return a new value, right? So this is how this track function works, right? This track method is useful to us, right? Now move to the second part, which is here we have this AbortController, right? So as you can see, here we had uses an AbortController, and by using this AbortController we had created a new instance of this AbortController, right? And finally, as you can see, this controller is being used where we had. So basically the function of this AbortController is this. Let's first understand this. So whenever, for example, here we have a button, okay, for example let's see, here we have a button, right? And for example I'm clicking this button in a continuous manner for 100 times, right? So even though if my first it should trigger 100 API request, right? So basically what this AbortController does to our application is it basically blocks the previous request if a new request comes in, right? So in simple words, it's basically blocks the previous request if new request comes in within the same time frame if our API is not resolved, right? Are you getting this? So that is how we basically use AbortController. And the final thing which you can see here is the cleanup. Okay, so cleanup is the same as if you are familiar with that React component, right? So it's same as the component lifecycle, which is component did destroy, right? So when that component will dies, right? For example, here we have this component, and when I switch the pages, for example I just switch the pages from this route to some another route, then this component will die, right? So what should our application with trigger if our component will die? So that part of that application is being controlled with this cleanup function, right? For example, for the function of this component, you had created a local state, okay, a local variable in your local database, right? And because you understand that that variable or that function, whatever you just store in your local storage, is not being used any other part of your application, right? So you don't want that to be existed in your computer anymore if this component is not there, if this component is not rendering, right? So you can even use this cleanup function to delete that keys or maybe any kind of data that you have stored locally, or any kind of variable that you had assigned here, right? Assign here, you should change its value, change it to null or anything, whatever you want, right? So that part is what is done by this cleanup function or the cleanup method provided by Qwik application, right? So as you can see here, we had executed this controller, that abort, right? So basically what we had does that we basically destroy this AbortController, which just we had created by in your user resources, right? So why we had just destroyed? Because after the dying of this component, we doesn't require this controller anymore. Okay, this abort controller anymore. So basically we had aborted this. So basically we also remove this controller dot abort function, right, in a controller by just assigning like this controller dot abort, right. Okay, so finally what we had done in this example, so here we had just created a state. So at the very initially we have this four so out of this four, we have this component, resource component, we have this state management library, state management module, we have these two hooks. This component hook is used to create this component, this user resource is used to fetch some data, external data from an external API, and here we had just assigned the string type, right. So the type of the value that is being used in our user resource. So here in this user resource function, we are basically willing to pass a value, and this value is so the output of this user resource is a value, which is, so this value is just a key, right, and the type of this value is so this is going to be an array of object, right. So that is what we specify here, right. So next we had created an async function. As you can see here, we had uses this async key, right, to denote that this is an async function, and here we just destructure two of our property provided by the Qwik application, that is the crack and cleanup, and which I had already discussed its use cases, right. So finally we had used this track to specify that whenever the value of this Qwik component, this Qwik state changes, we have to re-render this this user resource part, right, and computed its value once again, right. And here we have our controller, and here we just created a new instance of this abort controller from here, right, and we had executed this cleanup, right, as I had already discussed. Finally we just check, okay, if that query.value.length is less than 3, if whatever the value of that length we are getting getting in this function is less than 3, then let's return an empty array, okay. And else if this is not the case, then the program will go further, and you can see that we have a new URL we had just created, okay, and by just referring to this new .url, we just give an instruction to our system that okay, this is an URL, right, a path. So finally we had just see this, okay, url.search_param.set, we had finally set and queries, set our queries. For in our case we send some queries, so the name, so the key for that query is that query, and here we have the query.values, right. Okay, and where this query.values come from, as you can see, here we have our values, so here we have our query, and query.value we had just assigned to this query keyword, right. And finally this will be sent to this HTTP, so not HTTP, but it's URL, this URL, right. So after getting this response, after fetching the data, we as you can see here, that here we had used this controller.signal, right. So here we had used this controller.signal, right. So where this controller is coming from here, which we had just created from that abort controller, right. So here we are just giving a signal that whenever a new request comes in, if previous request is not resolved, just abort that previous request and just work with the only latest one, right. So finally whatever the data coming from this rest, we just converted into the JSON format, right. And after that finally we just specify that okay, and finally we just want to turn this JSON data into this format, and that format is result an object key, which is that result, and in this object key we have this so here we had just specified its type, right. And finally we have this result JSON.result output from this user resource key, and this value is now being stored in this jokers variable, okay, or the joker state, right. So now you can simply access this data by simply referring to this jokers, or you can use, as in our case we had used that use, so we have used this resource component, right? So here in this resource component we have our 3 states. So here at the first we had just specify, okay, which this resource is related to which resource, which use resource, so it relates to this one, right? So we just copy this and paste it here. The second one is we just specify here what should be done if if it is not resolved, it is in pending state, right? So till then we have just decided to show a loading in a text, right? And if that component is resolved, if this promise is resolved, we just want to access this data and map through this function, okay, and map the data, and finally use that ul and li tags to display these into bullet points, right? So as you can see here, right? So whenever I just change its value, it will make an API request and get the data, and whatever the data is being received is now being mapped like this, as you can see. Let's change this to something else, like maybe it's Qwik. And do we have some data for this? No, we do not have this data for this keyword. As you can see, we just making a request of joke, right? And we have all these points, and as you can see we have all these points. Let's see this in a bullet points node, in bullet point structure, as this is the first, this is the second, this is the third. So we have all these data coming from this keyword, right? So maybe I am just going to change this a joke, or to make it more specific, I am just going to add some new words, right? So this is how this will work. As if I just go with this return segment, you can simply see it's nothing different. It's just simply in this input tag, in this input, as you can see here, there we have our input, right? So in this input we just bind its value to this Qwik state which we had created by using that use signal, right? And finally we have a button to search. We can manually trigger this if we don't find that it automatic get triggered. So basically you don't need to trigger this search button, because it is automatic get triggered every time the value of this Qwik has changed, and why and from where it is being indicated. It is indicating from this target methods, right, which is an inbuilt function. Okay, so finally we have uses this resource to get the value of this resource, to get all the values coming from this use resource, and finally use this into our component to create our data, okay, to create our data or to create our UI, right? So that is how the whole program will work, and I think this is going to be a more practical way or a more practical scenario to give you an idea of how you can use this into your Qwik application, right? Okay, so I think for now this is enough, and we will meet you in our next video. Okay, and in next video I'm going to have a discussion around how you can pass states, and by using props, what is a props and how you can pass that props into the state. So all of these are going to be the topic of our next video. So for this video I think I should end this here, and let's meet you in our next video. Till then, have a nice day and goodbye.